I'm Tom Abrams. I'm a professor in the Department of Pharmacology at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Before I begin, I just want to say I'm standing in front of an image of Davidge Hall, which was the oldest building in the School of Medicine, built in 1812, just 2 years before Francis Scott Key wrote the lyrics or the verses that ultimately were used for the national anthem. In the subsequent video, you're going to hear from a handful of students and colleagues at the University of Maryland and Baltimore, and mentees and a colleague at Stanford University School of Medicine. Laure Aurelian was fierce and courageous, highly critical with very high standards, and she was extremely smart. She had little tolerance for mediocrity, but at the same time, she was extremely supportive of her students and her collaborators, and this was an incongruous mix. When I arrived in Baltimore at UMB in the summer of 1995, Laure worked on viruses and was interested in cancer. I was a synaptic neurobiologist interested in learning and synaptic plasticity. So our interests were quite different. But gradually, over the next handful of years, they began to converge. Laure and her colleagues had been studying a form of herpes, the type 2 variant, that when it infected nerve cells, it didn't kill them. And she and her colleagues, including Colin Hunter and Cindy Smith, whom you'll hear from later, found that this virus coded for a protein kinase. And this protein kinase activity from the virus, when it was expressed in the host cells, in the neurons, it stimulated a cascade that involved RAS and MAP kinase. We knew that the MAP kinase cascade promoted synapse formation, process outgrowth, and inhibited cell death. So Laure and her colleagues speculated that rather than just being neutral, this type 2 variant might actually benefit the infected nerve cells, which is quite a radical idea. They went on to test this hypothesis, first in a cell line, and the cells in the cell line that would have been under culture conditions where they would have died were prevented from cell death. But then Laure went on and spoke with a number of neuroscientists at the University of Maryland, including Edna Pereira, whom you'll also hear from, and began to test this hypothesis in a number of neural systems where the neurons were fated to die, such as a Parkinson's model. And in each case, the neurons were protected from cell death, and this protection depended on the expression of the viral protein kinase in the infected nerve cell. So this was really a radical result, quite surprising. Most of it would expect that the neurons at least would go ahead and die if they wouldn't be adversely affected by the virus in addition to the other factors that cause cell death. And it was really rather remarkable. Because my lab worked on cell signaling, Laure and I began to interact more. And a handful of years later, when I led a new course for incoming biomedical grad students, almost all the biomedical grad students on campus, and early in the course, I presented a lecture on hypothesis testing, and I wanted to present an example of rigorous science, and I considered examples on campus. It was Laure's work on this type 2 variant of herpes that I chose to present. It was a beautiful example of what Karl Popper called an extreme test of a hypothesis, because the results were really unlikely, but they were consistent with the hypothesis. So if they succeeded, it meant that the hypothesis was that much more likely to be correct. Now, Laure wasn't just interested in testing her hypothesis. She was interested in developing therapeutic tools that could benefit patients with neurodegenerative disorders. And in general, she was an early advocate of gene therapy, not using gene therapy to correct defects in the patient's genome, but using gene therapy to activate signaling cascades that would benefit the patients. Now, Laure was highly critical, as I mentioned, and she was very often skeptical about others' motivations and about how things would play out. And this came up repeatedly in our discussions, both of events on campus and also events on the larger stage, nationally and internationally. I would say that you could say that she was quite cynical. I, on the other hand, had grown up in New York and had a fairly privileged background. In contrast, Laura initially grew up under the Nazis in Romania and then under the Soviets until her family was able to exit for Israel when she was about 9 or 10 years old. And in those days, Israel was not a very easy country to live in. It was, I think, things were a struggle. Nevertheless, she did extremely well. And she was the first woman PhD student at Hopkins Med School. When she finished her degree, she faced serious opposition from faculty discouraging her from becoming an independent investigator, telling her that the NIH wouldn't fund a woman. And yet she persevered and obviously succeeded quite brilliantly. When we would discuss these instances where we disagreed, I found, after passage of time, very often it turned out Laura was right. And I would tell her this very sadly, Laura, you were correct. And she remembered these disagreements. And we didn't back down. We remained good friends. And she would remind me even years later about how she had been right. She loved this. Now, Laura was fiercely supportive of her students and her colleagues and postdocs. She was invested in each of them in supporting their development as independent scientists. And she also was available to a range of students, both those who were extremely gifted, such as MD, PhD students, and others who were very successful from the outset, and other students who had been struggling, perhaps in other labs. In each case, she got very invested. And in the majority of cases, she succeeded, but she was quite critical and had high standards. And sometimes the students left the lab, perhaps for another lab, or they just pursued another career. But in general, her trainees were very successful. And I noticed years later how they reciprocated and were very faithful to Laura, just as she had been so supportive to them. Now, in the last handful of years, Laura and I began to collaborate on a difficult project, and she was very invested. We spoke just the day before she died, and I noticed again how committed she was and how supportive of my work she was. And this was despite the fact that Laura was substantially older and had some health issues, but she really was a true friend. So in closing, I just want to say I feel very, very fortunate to have had Laura as a friend and as a colleague for all these years.
Well, I had the pleasure of working with Laura for many years, and I found her to be one of the most brilliant women I have ever known. And not only was she a wonderful colleague, but she really was a very good friend as well. And Laura and I started to work together at Johns Hopkins University, and then we moved over to the University of Maryland School of Medicine, where I helped her set up the Virology Immunology Lab in the Department of Pharmacology. Now, our early research involved looking at the role of herpes simplex type 2 in cervical carcinoma. And in doing this work, the lab identified a protein that we called ICP-10 and showed the role of this protein in cervical cancer. And our subsequent research spent much time looking at the mechanisms and the significance of this protein in oncogenesis. Now, I remember many late nights working with Laura on papers, as well as grants to try to meet the many grant deadlines. And before electronic submissions, Mike Kolka and I used to have to drive the grants down to the NIH to make sure that they got there on time. But my best memories of Laura were really the times we spent working with the many postdocs and students that passed through the lab. And I know the students really meant a lot to her. And I remember one time we were sitting in a graduation ceremony together, and we had 2 students graduating that year. And she looked at me and she said, I'm really proud of these kids. They're just like my children. And Laura really was an excellent teacher. I saw many of a student come into the lab as a raw rookie and leave as an accomplished scientist. And many of these students have gone on to very successful careers. Now, we had students, postdocs, and staffs from all over the world. And I remember one time walking through the lab, we had several different phones in the lab, and 5 people were on the phone, and nobody was speaking English. So I fondly referred to the lab as a little United Nations. And it was really nice having people in the lab from different countries because it allowed me to learn about many different cultures. Now, as I already mentioned, Laura was also a very good friend, and we had many discussions that had nothing to do with science. And I remember when I was thinking about getting married that Laura gave her stamp of approval to my future husband, and this meant a lot to me. Also, I have good memories of the many parties that she had at her house, particularly the Christmas parties. And I know that she and Irving and Amalia really enjoyed the Christmas chocolates that I made every year. I also attended Amalia's wedding and really enjoyed the Passover dinner that she invited me to have with her family. Now, Laura and I went to many scientific meetings together in Europe, and in addition to attending the scientific meetings, we visited many of the sites, and I particularly enjoyed the museums that we visited, art museums, because Laura was very knowledgeable about European art, and she really educated me about many of the European artists. Now, Laura spoke several different languages, and this was really useful in getting around Europe, particularly in France, where she spoke fluent French. So this leads me to a couple of funny stories I'd like to tell. One of them involved the fact that she was fluent in many different languages, and one of these was Hebrew. And this is when we were at a meeting in London, and we went to a restaurant, a Middle Eastern restaurant, one evening, and the restaurant was fairly empty, but there were 2 guys sitting at a table next to us, having quite a bit to drink, and they began talking in Hebrew about all of the activities they were having with their specific girlfriends the night before. And they were being quite graphic about this. And they had no clue that we understood anything because we were speaking English. But of course, Laura, knowing Hebrew, she was translating all this to me, and we got a big laugh about it. But the funniest part of this story was when we went to pay the bill. That evening, we didn't use a credit card. We paid in cash, and we gave the waiter more money than the bill. And instead of telling him to keep the change right away, Laura waited till he walked halfway across the room. And then she yells out in Hebrew, "The service was wonderful, keep the change." And then we both looked over at the 2 guys and winked at them and started laughing. And this is a story that we laughed about for many years. Then the other funny story I'd like to tell, although there were many other ones, was one time when I had a crab feast at my house. And of course, Laura came to that, but she really wasn't supposed to eat crabs because of her Jewish religion. But yet she really wanted to have crabs, so she had a few of them, and I know she really enjoyed them. But when it came time for her to leave, she didn't want Irving to know she had crabs and smell the Old Bay seasoning. So I remember running into the house, getting mouthwash and soap and water, and we literally washed her down. And she went home, and I don't know if to this day Irving ever realized that she had crabs that day. So I'd just like to conclude by saying that Laura had a great impact on many people's lives, including mine, and she will be greatly missed.
Hello, my name is Colin Hunter. I have known Dr. Laure Aurelian since 1987, more than half my life. I came to this country then to study for my PhD in immunology and microbiology at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. I first met Dr. Aurelian as the lecturer in the virology course, and was so impressed that I asked her to be my mentor for my PhD. My early days at the university were a little rocky, but nevertheless, Dr. Aurelian saw something in me. She agreed for me to join her lab to do my PhD research in herpes virus and cervical cancer. and became one of the family. This was a lab of, no matter who you were, which position you held, you were part of the Aurelian virology lab family. Many stories, many happy, some stern moments, but overall, just an amazing place to work, an amazing place to study, an amazing place to learn. Dr. Aurelian's degree was PhD, of course, as everybody knows. For most people, for most scientists, the PH in the PhD really isn't that accurate. It's not really a philosophy degree for most scientists. For most scientists, their PhD is science. For Dr. Aurelian, that was not the case. She was a scientist, certainly, but she was also a philosopher. Her facility with languages was legendary. She, of course, spoke English, Hebrew, Italian, to name but three. But it went further than that. She also spoke the language of science. She spoke the language of art. She spoke the language of music. She really was a modern Renaissance woman. There were very few areas in which she did not have expertise. I remember after one of my multiple transgressions, I was in her office and getting a lesson on responsibility. And I remember she quoted Shakespeare to me. I was able to identify the quote as from Macbeth, made a stab at which act it was in, and got that wrong. Dr. Aurelian, of course, knew not just which play it was from, not just which act it was from, but also knew which scene it was from. Just a typical example of not your average sign. After my graduation, we entered the next stage of our relationship. With most labs, with most advisors and PhD graduates, there is not a lot of contact afterwards, after graduation. There'll be obviously the request for references, but in general, people tend to make some distance between their lab and their career. This was not the case with me and Dr. Aurelian. One of the few areas where she did not have expertise was in computing. And fortunately, that was an area which I do have expertise. And many would be the night from graduation onwards until very recently. There would be calls for computer assistance. I would leave work, go to her home. She would always make dinner for me. We'd have a good heart-to-heart, really some very deep conversations that meant a very great deal to me, helping me with a lot of events in my life, and real motherly. It was not a PhD mentor-mentee relationship. Again, going back to the concept of the lab and the family, this really was a deepening of our relationship, our personal relationship. And while it was good to be able to help Laure Aurelian with her computer issues, and also Dr. Kessler as well, the evenings were far more than that. They were good conversations, deep, meaningful times. And I really will miss all of these. I miss the lab. I miss the computer questions, the tirades, and we always had a solution. Things always ended up well, and really, this is a huge loss to myself, to Aurelian's family, and to the scientific community, both to Stanford and to University of Maryland. I really miss her, and I am most thankful that I had the opportunity and the privilege of working with her, being her student, and virology classes, being her PhD mentee, graduate, and then being her friend and computer consultant. And I think that's where I shall leave it. Again, thank you very much, and it was an honor to be able to give this this presentation. Thank you.
First of all, Tom, thanks for the opportunity to share an anecdote about Dr. Laure Aurelian from the Department of Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics. I think of the many I could share, perhaps the most telling was when she used the speakerphone to call down to the laboratory, and she specifically, over the PA, asked for me to come up to the office. And I wasn't exactly sure what this was going to be about. We didn't have a set time that we were going to discuss any results or anything. I didn't know if it might be a wood shedding. You just don't know what's going to happen. So I walked down the hall, and she was in her conference room where she had all her bound volumes of different scientific journals. It was a sort of a hallowed place. So she was sitting at the head of the conference table, and I sat a couple of chairs down, doesn't really matter where. But I sat down, I brought my notebook of recent experiments just to be prepared. And she sat there and she looked at me for a moment and didn't say a thing. And then she said, "Why on earth do cells kill themselves?" And I thought, wait a minute, I've finished my orals already. But I thought, okay, she's asking me why is there such a thing as apoptosis? And I went, well, there are different signaling pathways, and there are thresholds probably of other factors that have yet to be discovered yet and everything. She said, no, that's not at all what I'm talking about. And I said, okay, let me think. And she said, no, you don't really need to think of an answer. She said, why would a cell decide to kill itself for another? And this actually really sort of started opening my eyes to this philosophy that she had of, the doing of the science is the how. It's the molecular, it's the cellular, it's the how are mechanisms. Let's tease the mechanisms out so we can figure out how things occur. But she was talking on the why level, the global level, that we needed to take a step back and take the grand picture of why are we doing this research and what is the greater good of it and how does it fit into a larger application of life. So I realized then, and she explicitly stated later in that conversation, it's not enough to get your degree here. You earn your degree. You're not given your degree, you earn it here. And 2 letters in the abbreviation are PH. And it's important for you to become a philosopher of life who has a niche in science. She said, you need to develop your interests more widely, more and at a greater height to kind of have a bird's eye view of things. Because I'm not teaching you to be a technician, and neither are the postdocs. Everybody can be taught to do assays, but you have to be able to lead, and you have to be able to question and think of questions that don't even really apply to what you're doing in the laboratory. So with that, I realized, with her own background, that so philosophy was going to be at least important, tantamount to doing research. And I really appreciated that. In a way, I felt that kind of gave me, it liberated me a little bit to start to think. And I began to really read widely. I began to read in immunology and other fields. And it really worked for me. I was able to begin to see patterns and things, and my other friends who'd be in other laboratories and other departments, and they would talk about like the LAT protein in T cell signaling. And I go, oh yeah, I just read that paper, and so we could have this talk, So, we were never sure that what we read widely is going to be directly applicable, but on the other hand, it made you just that much more educated, and you had a better bird's eye view of things. As a student, I could observe her going to different meetings, whether they were admin meetings or just, dealing with the day-to-day of the lab. But she also had, alongside that, in parallel, her vast interest in the arts, her love of opera, of classical music, certainly something she and I shared. I loved classical music. And I could see that it was as important to her as her scientific life to be developing and furthering her art life as well. And again, whether there might be cross-pollination of those two areas or not, the cross-pollination wasn't really important. It would be nice if things sort of did, but it was, you were developing yourself as a human being to your full potential by not solely going down a rabbit hole of your own research, but to develop your own interests and to find new interests. And I think, I think that was the greatest gift from Laure Aurelian. What started with a walk down the hallway to her office ended with a pathway to greater self-reflection and growth.
Hi there, I'm Sam Wales. I was one of Dr. Laure Aurelian's PhD students. Shortly after she passed away, I took some time to reflect on our relationship, and I wrote a letter to Amalia, which I'm going to kind of read for you all here, edit it a little bit. If I'm honest, aside from my own mother, Dr. Laure Aurelian was one of the most influential women in my life. So I wanted to just share my history with her, with everybody. So I first met her while interviewing at Oryx Inc. in 1998. I was fresh out of college and pretty desperate to get a job in Baltimore, which would allow me to move out of my parents' house, which I really wanted to do. I don't remember a ton from those days, but I can recall that my overall impression of the interviewing process was that Gary and Sandy were really nice and Dr. Aurelian was polite, which Amalia got spot on in her eulogy and had me laughing through the tears. But her pointed questions definitely made me aware of just how much I didn't know. For some reason, she must have seen some promise in me because I got the job. So fast forward to after the clinical trials that took place at Oryx, and it transitioned to a nutritional company, which I was not really that interested in. And I had visions of becoming a pharmacist. I thought the PCATs would be easier than the MCATs. I thought the job would be fairly easy and I could make a decent living and still, have plenty of free time to do whatever I wanted to do. I must have mentioned this to Laura at some point, and she was having none of it. She invited me to her office in MSTF to have a conversation, and before I knew it, she was introducing me to Edson, saying that she wanted me to be her student. So I'm 1,000% sure I would not have made it into the department without her support. So it was a fairly difficult transition for me to go from working a regular full-time job and having plenty of free time to spend with friends and to entering graduate school with Laura's expectations. She only made me cry once. I'll never forget her telling me that I was intellectually lazy in her shrill voice, but she wasn't wrong, and sadly I'm still not up to par in my reading of the literature. But her intentions were to motivate me to my full potential. I knew her to be a strong woman who didn't respect weakness, so I didn't let her see my tears, but I became stronger for it. I began to understand her more in that first year of graduate school when I saw her mama bear come out. Long story short, once she deemed you worthy, she was a fiercely loyal woman who would defend her own at any cost. She was so brilliant. I'm still in awe of her massive creativity for the opposite ways to use the precious ICP-10 PK to either kill cancer cells or save neurons. I have to laugh now a little bit at the terror I would sometimes feel hearing her keys jingle as she would walk down the hall, though I'm pretty sure she did that deliberately so that we'd have time to all get back to work. As she would beckon me to accompany her to the bathroom while in conversation. Still to this day, I don't know anyone who does that, but Laura did that. And every time we would hear the click of the intercom, I would think, please not me, please not me. But I can still 1000% hear her voice. Sam, to the office, please. Sam, to the office. The infamous journal clubs with so much wine and so much more. She inspired as much loyalty in her students as she gave to them. I don't believe I would have been so easily swayed to fetch sandwiches and water plants for anyone else, but how does one say no to a force such as Laura? I can't say I was surprised when at my thesis defense, when there weren't really any questions, she asked the one question she knew that I didn't know. Once again, letting me know how much I don't know. But to this day, I think that's one of my most valuable assets, to have the humility to know that there's so much more to learn, always. If only I wasn't so damned intellectually lazy. Once I left the lab, I really enjoyed keeping in touch with her. I'd gone back and read through all of our correspondences. She was so overjoyed when Theo was born. She was so happy for me and my career, and she had become a good friend. She had always had such good advice, even when it wasn't something you necessarily wanted to hear. Now I realize she was pretty much always on point. I am so glad that I got her mailing address in California so that she could see through my holiday cards how my family was progressing. After my husband died suddenly in 2017, she sent me an email with her condolences, reminding me that my son needed me now more than ever, and that while it didn't remove the pain, it provided a life purpose that, together with daily work, helps life continue. She ended her email signing, "Please remember you have friends who care." I will miss my mentor, Laura, who always had sage advice and who had become a great friend, very much. But I'm also comforted to know that I'm not alone in the sadness of her loss. Thanks for listening.
As it's always very hard for me to speak of Laura in the past tense. As a graduate student and later on as a faculty at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, I was incredibly lucky to have worked closely with Laura, her brilliant and innovative mind, and her dedication to science were evident everywhere she was, whether it was in the classroom, the lab, and everything she was a part of. She was a giant, overcoming the difficulties women in science faced in the early 70s, not only to become a world-renowned expert in the biology of herpes viruses, but most importantly, to pave the way for generations to come in the science of oncolytic viruses and their potential applications in gene therapy. She worked fiercely with her trainees, and through her guidance and high standards, we all learned to become critical thinkers and seekers of knowledge. In the mid-2000s, when she was already well known for her work throughout the world, she impressed me when she decided to bridge the fields of virology and neurosciences, something that was so new to her, through an HSV1 gene product that she hypothesized would have neuroprotective effects. She established numerous successful collaborations, and it was at that time that I worked closely with her. And those collaborations led to groundbreaking findings and propelled many of her doctoral students and postdoctoral fellows and her collaborators to new heights. I will certainly miss the incredible scientist and mentor that Laure was. But above all, I will miss my dearest friend. I will forever be grateful and cherish the fond memories of Laure taking the time to listen attentively to my son's stories of his lower school adventures. He attended Park School, same place that, same school that Amalia attended, and they spent, Eric and Laura, Eric, my son, and Laura spent hours on end speaking of everything that was happening at Park every time that he came to the department, and he he saw her. I will also remember how her eyes twinkled and her smile lit up the room every time that she spoke of Amalia with so much care and so much love for her and for Amalia and for the grandkids. And I'll never forget how she reached out to me when I needed most. Her legacy will definitely live on in the countless lives that she touched and the discoveries she made. And I would like to end this just leaving a picture, as for me, pictures always speak more than words. And I hope this will be just a glimpse on how amazing Laura was to all of us. I will forever miss her. And I hope one day I'll have a chance to talk to Amalia and the grandkids and everyone in the family on how wonderful Laura was, and personally share our uh, our memories with everyone. So here is to a dearest friend. I hope everyone will be able to see the pictures of a time we enjoyed so much with Laura. So I'll see you all at some point.
I worked with Laure in Stanford Medicine's Office of Faculty Development and Diversity for 8 years. We had neighboring offices through our time together, even amidst 3 office moves. In fact, at one point, we both had electric heaters running at the same time in our over air-conditioned offices, and we triggered a small power outage on our entire floor. Oops. We had a good giggle together over our shared love of being warm. This is actually a view of the courtyard right near our offices. For me, Laure was a colleague, a sounding board, a mother figure, and most of all, a friend. We would trade off going to each other's offices, starting a conversation about work, then really getting comfortable and talking about any upcoming vacations or travel plans, or mostly our families. Laura loved telling me stories about Amalia, Stella, and Ari. And she genuinely seemed to appreciate hearing stories about my children as well. She also always asked after my mother. My mother is from France, and once we discovered we could all speak in French to one another, it felt like we were even closer. We had our own secret language. When I had my first child, my son, Laure regaled me with the unbelievable story of going into labor with Amalia amidst a site review for one of her grants. She continued as far as she could as though everything were okay, until it became apparent that she really did need to get to the hospital. The story really reflected her tough as nails attitude at work. But then she would talk about Amalia or her grandchildren, and her softy attitude would come through. A few years later, when I had my daughter, once again, she was more excited than anyone else. She also brought me such thoughtful gifts from what she knew Stella and Ari had loved so much when they were little. To this day, the 3 Knuffle Bunny books are favorites in our household. Laura also loved a good party and tended to be the life of the party. She came to both my son and daughter's first birthday parties, and my entire family still remembers their delightful conversations with her. Through our office in Stanford Medicine, Laura taught 4 annual workshops to our faculty, 3 on writing career development grants, or K awards, and 1 on manuscript writing and collaboration. Following her workshops, she developed mentorship relationships with those who subsequently sought one-on-one help from her, and she ended up mentoring over 80 Stanford Medicine faculty. Her success rate with the faculty specifically applying for grants was 94% upon first submission. These figures are simply incredible and speak to her brilliance, yes, but they also speak to the unending engagement and support she provided to all mentees. You had to work hard if you're going to work with Laura, but she definitely made it worth your time. Through it all, Laura had a sharp wit, an authenticity all her own, and a kind, kind soul. Boy, do I miss her.
I first met Laure back in 2013, probably not long after she moved here from Maryland. I had crashed miserably on my previous attempt at a KO8, so I decided to attend her workshop and participate in her K pilot program. It was immediately clear that this was not your typical grant writing workshop. If you could take the tough love that came with this one-on-one interaction, you could completely transform your grant. I remember that sunken feeling I would get after receiving my revisions back with red ink written everywhere over it. I quickly found out that this was a lot better than a completely blank page, which usually meant it was so bad that it wasn't worth her time. Through these weekly meetings that went on for months, I gradually learned how to write more efficiently, forcefully, and persuasively, to channel my inner Israeli, as Laure would say. After a successful KO8, minus a few years in between, I continued to meet with Laure regularly, as she helped me prepare 2 R01s, a resubmission, and a manuscript. Laure provided a steadying force during a tumultuous time. I look forward to our regular meetings just to chat about family, vaccines and the pandemic, and occasionally politics. Her mentorship was pivotal to my recent promotion from an instructor to assistant professor that occurred last spring. This past grant cycle, I found myself working on another grant, this time on my own. As I proofread it again and again, I channeled my inner Laure, kept editing this line or that. Too passive, too many words. I miss Laure greatly and think of her often. She is gone, but she will not be forgotten. As a coda, I found out last month that the R01 that we worked on together, my first R01, was funded. Thank you.
First, I want to thank the organizers for allowing me to talk at this memorial for Laure Aurelian. I mean, deciding what I was going to say today, I ultimately decided that I would read a letter that I wrote to Laura on the day of her passing. Dear Laura, thank you for your mentoring that you've given me over the years. I recall the first time that we met in the K writing class, your immediate willingness to help with my application, the laser precision you aimed at the application's many faults, and your patient guidance to reconstruct each sentence and produce not only 1, but 2 Ks. This was the start of an amazing academic journey, leading to a successful K application, professorship appointment at Stanford, high impact publications, and a successful R01 application on the first try. A fact that I try to impress upon my kids is like hitting a home run on your first at-bat in the majors. I credit you with that success, Laura. Thank you for the tough love, red marks so many that, as you would say, the page was bleeding. Soon I learned that the bleeding page was not the darkest place, that yet darker was the page without red marks, which simply meant that you could not bear to continue, or that what was written was beyond all comprehension. Indeed, this lack of red marks characterized your editing of our last specific aims page that we worked on together. However, unlike previous experience, this specific aims page lacked edits because the writing was and the science was cogent. I thought to myself, had I finally graduated? Sadly, I wish we could have had many more years of collaboration. When you passed, I felt unmoored, floating in a vast ocean without your steady hand to guide the ship. In this, I want you to know that the grant was submitted, that the writing was described as concise and clean, and a joy to read. Thank you for your kindness and unwavering support. You were a constant and steady light in the darkness of grant submissions, professorship appointments, manuscript writing, endless revisions. I am stunned by your passing. but I know that the love you gave, the lessons taught will continue to touch countless lives, not only through the mentees and their families, but also through their scientific discoveries and achievements. Lastly, I wanted to thank your family for your generosity in sharing you with us. The day of your funeral, I sat in the backyard stunned, wondering what my career would look like without you. Just at that moment, a white butterfly landed on the bench that I was sitting. It lingered for several moments, then flew away. Somehow I felt like you were there, allaying my uncertainty and saying a last goodbye. Laura, you'll be missed dearly. I have so many wishes and hopes, but I know that ultimately in my success and in my mentorship to others, that I carry your legacy forward. Thank you for this opportunity to speak today.
Hi, this is Sarah Goldhuber-Fiebert from Stanford. Laura will live on in each of us as an inspiration and a role model, a true mensch, both in her scientific work and in her life. She had a knack for cutting straight to the deep, meaningful connections and content. Laura would often first meet Stanford colleagues or mentees at some large event or workshop, and by the end of a 15-minute tea break, she'd be eliciting and sharing about vital tidbits from decades ago. She was always exacting scientifically in both methods and writing, while full of kindness to the whole person doing the writing. With compassion, she would edit extensively with critical and helpful feedback. Laura edited my first grant application, as she did for many others. She personified kind and tough love, as everyone knew she wanted the best for them, their work, and their impact on the world amidst her detailed and helpful critiques. There is a saying in multiple cultures that someone's soul does not truly die until everyone they impacted dies, and that will be a very long time for Laura. To Amalia, Irving, and all of Laura's family, thank you for sharing Laura with Stanford and with the world. May her memory be a blessing to all who knew her.
Hi, my name is Vivian Tofik, and I just wanted to share a few thoughts about Dr. Laure Aurelian, who was really instrumental in my success as a physician scientist here at Stanford. I met Dr. Aurelian around 2013 or 2014 when she first came to Stanford, and I was in the audience of one of her Kate Award workshops. And I remember sitting there and just being so impressed by her within the first moments of her speaking, when she started going through in detail all of her experience as a NIH grant recipient and an NIH grant reviewer over the course of her illustrious 40 or so year career. I sat in the audience and I listened to her speaking with such knowledge and also with such humor at the whole process, and really just an interest in making sure that everybody in the audience could succeed. The thing that also struck me, of course, was her accent, because I hadn't heard an accent like that except in my own mother. And so I felt a real warmth and attraction to her right away, because my mother also has a sort of difficult to identify, maybe multilingual English accent. So I immediately messaged my husband and I told him that I had this incredible professor teaching us about grant writing, and I was really impressed by her and felt that I was, you know, really her soulmate. And so he encouraged me to speak with her after the class. And I sort of shyly walked up to her and said, you know, I would love some help working with her on grants, and if she was willing. And oh, by the way, you know, where was she from? Because I really, you know, recognized her accent in my own mother. And she looked at me sort of surprised and said, well, where is your mother from? How could she possibly have the same accent as I do? And I said, well, you know, she's Lebanese, but she was born in Japan and she grew up speaking Arabic, and then we're Jewish. So she spoke Hebrew and French and English and Spanish and then some Japanese. And she sort of looked at me and started laughing. And she said, well, I speak a lot of those languages also. And so maybe that's why you're sort of hearing similarities. And I think in that moment, we just connected so strongly. And then it was sort of this amazing relationship of mentor and mentee and friend and close confidant for the next 7 years. And she helped me get grants, and she celebrated holidays and welcomed my family into hers at the Jewish holidays. And it was really just such a special relationship. I couldn't have even imagined having somebody like her in my life. And of course was, extremely, upset to hear that she passed. And so I think about her all the time. And I feel very lucky to have had those years with her and with her wonderful family. And I know that many people have special memories like that as well. And she really was just an amazing, amazing person. And I still, every time I write a grant, I can hear her yelling at me, don't have muddy thinking. You need to have clear hypotheses. You need to have courage to have a hypothesis. And I know that I am where I am today at Stanford as an assistant professor because of her support and her love. So I'm looking forward to hearing more memories, and wish you all the best.